Hello and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, the stories we tell and why they matter. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Let's see, next slide. As a reminder for everyone joining the Lunch and Learn today, there is a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so that we can assist you. Additionally, a recording will be sent to everyone of today's webinar. This brings us to our presenters for today. Our presenters are Anna Ebre-Plaster. Anna is a writer and storyteller. Her work provides unique stories from herself as a Cuban American and her family's experience coming to the US as refugees. Anna's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and PBS. Anna usually joins us from Lexington, Massachusetts, but I believe today she's in Fort Lauderdale. And we also thank Anna. She recently had surgery there on her arm. So if we see her elevating her arm, we'll but we thank you, Anna.
Thank you for the reminder to elevate.
Right, exactly. Your doctor will appreciate that. We also have Cheryl Hamilton with us. Cheryl has devoted her career to advancing more inclusive communities and storytelling. She is the founder and director of Stellar Story Company. Stellar Story Company helps people and institutions deliver extraordinary stories and unforgettable events that lead to meaningful change. Previously, she directed programs for local, national, and international refugee organizations. She is also the curator and coach for the national television show Stories from the Stage, featured on PBS and World Channel. And as many of you joining us today know from your experiences welcoming refugees or coming to this country as refugees yourself, refugee resettlement reveals many compelling stories. Today, Anna may share with us some of her experience. We will also have a chance to learn from Cheryl and Anna how stories influence people and how we all view each other, and also how storytellers can be thoughtful in our choices. Let me see. And we also have been having a little bit of technical difficulty today, which we thought we had resolved with the video. So we'll also be sharing a link which you all can view after today's webinar of some storytelling on the stage. But with that, I will hand it over. And Cheryl and Anna, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my goodness, thank you for having me. We're really excited, both of us. And I want to second that, Anna, thank you for tuning in so shortly after your surgery. And thanks to everybody else for tuning in. When I joined the refugee field 22 years ago, after graduating from Clark University, like Brianna, I never imagined that I would have a storytelling organization. I studied forced migration. I thought I was going to be a policy person, service provider. I was for 20 years. But now, given the work that all of you online do and the people I've met, we know that the stories need to be elevated and amplified, and hearing from diverse voices is really important. And we're going to be glad to do that today. So as you said, I'm going to be interviewing Anna about her experience. I'm going to be offering some background about my storytelling relative to refugee resettlement. And then we really do want to hear from all of you and get some questions and direct them and answer how we can be helpful to you. My entree into refugee resettlement followed 5,000 Somali immigrants moving into my hometown in Lewiston, Maine, shortly after 9/11. It's an experience that in 2008, I actually wrote a one-woman show about, and I traveled for 5 years performing at many of the National Resettlement Agency's conferences and theaters. And what I found from that experience was that the conversation shifted. For so long, I've been doing presentations and PowerPoints about how to build inclusive communities. But suddenly, when you start sharing a story, you start having conversations and you find the things that, in fact, we have more in common. And that experience eventually led me to doing more storytelling, launching some storytelling series featuring refugee voices, all of which, again, perpetuating and building inclusive communities. We don't need the slide anymore. People know who we are. Our organization does a lot of training and for nonprofits and others about storytelling. But let's just have a conversation, because I met Anna through storytelling, and she has taught me so much about the Cuban resettlement experience, about her life and relative to belonging. And let's just kick it off there. So Anna, how did you get into telling and writing your story?
I feel like when you go through a refugee experience like we did at when you're 5 years old, like I was, your whole life you're telling the story. Your people are asking you because your name is different, or they hear you speaking a different language. So I've been telling the story all my life. Oh, you're not from here. Well, where are you from? How did you get here? Oh, I thought people from Cuba couldn't come easily. And so I feel like I was sort of telling the story all my life. But as far as writing, I started writing about the refugee experience and about Cuba in the 90s during one of the rafting crises that we had in Cuba, and trying to shed light on that experience and what our family was going through, having, you know, one of our cousins on one of those rafts and not knowing where he was, and finally finding that he was, you know, in Guantanamo. And I found that people were very interested in this. They had no idea about the details. It's one thing to hear, you know, a blurb on TV or read something, and another to hear that, oh, my grandmother is crying because she doesn't know where her grandnephew is, and no one can tell us. And so sharing that helped me feel like, you know, the world was learning about what had happened to our family and was interested, and it was satisfying for me.
When did you, so you talked about writing about your cousin. Did you start with essays about yourself, or did you jump right into a book, or were you writing political essays? What were you writing?
I was writing first person essays, generally having to do with me and my experience as a refugee / immigrant, whatever. But tying it always to the current events in Cuba. Cuba, you know, punches above its weight in terms of the news, right? It's a small country, but if you pay attention, it's constantly in the news cycle. And so there were news hooks that I could use, but in those hooks, I tried to make things as personal as possible so that people could relate. You know, we were talking about that earlier.
Mm-hmm. And you also wrote about your resettlement experience in New Hampshire, right? Or coming to New Hampshire. What was that like in the early days? Because we have a lot of people here that are trying to help welcome refugees.
Yeah, so we came in 1967. I was just almost 6 years old. We were in a refugee processing center in Miami for like 2 days. And then we were given boots and hats and coats and ended up in Nashua, New Hampshire, in the middle of a snowstorm. There were very few. There was only a couple of other Cuban families there. That's how we ended up there. We were one of whatever, you know, a small community, and so we were not threatening because there were so few of us. But people were very curious about us and, generally speaking, welcoming, which I always try to point out in my writing and in my storytelling, that most humans have that capacity to set aside differences, and even if it's through curiosity and maybe awkward curiosity, it could be a way of connecting and of finding what's common between people. So we were very lucky to have ended up where we did, even though we didn't have any kind of refugee agency that we worked with. We were just living off the kindness of strangers, literally.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then how has your writing evolved in the last, you know, few decades? I know that you have a memoir coming out, I hear. Tell us about that.
The publisher in the UK is going to publish my memoir. So it'll be in the US and in the UK. And how has it evolved? Well, rather than I guess it's evolved in in that I'm trying to expand from just my story. I've used it to understand my family members' stories, because we came as an extended family over time. Each person had a very different experience. And so I've tried to collect those experiences so that they're not lost. And what I found is that my children and my nieces and nephews have learned so much about their family because I've captured these stories. But also there are enough universal truths in those stories that you don't have to be a refugee to understand what all of that, the value of all of that, and the lessons from all of that. So I guess it's broadened over time. The scope of it has broadened over time. I try not to stay too political in my stories, although the political messages are inescapable, because in the end, it's about people trying to be free and doing everything they can to be free. And unfortunately, in today's political environment, people, depending on the political lens they're looking at it from, they'll put up obstacles they don't want to hear because they think you're coming from one side of the political spectrum versus the other. And it's not about that. It's about just decency, human decency, the human need to be free. And it's not about left and right. And so I try to convey that in my writing too.
Was it difficult in the beginning to be vulnerable and share really personal moments?
Yeah, I mean, I actually, started writing partly, because I wanted people to know about our story. But what I realized is that I was learning about my own story. I had forgotten many of the worst things that happened to us. And only when I began to write did those memories come back. And some of them were pretty awful memories, just of what was going on in a 5-year-old brain in the middle of all this turmoil. I slept in the same bed with my grandmother, who cried every single night. She cried all day long, actually. And I was terrified of falling asleep. I would hear voices at night. All of that stuff I had put completely aside, and only through writing did those things come back. Sometimes I wish they hadn't come back, because you don't want to look at that stuff. But on the other hand, it's the truth, and knowing the truth is really important.
Well, we talked about in storytelling, it's a vehicle for making meaning of your own life, right? This is why, in many ways, it's a gift to take pause and reflect on our lives and try to tell the stories, and then choose when and where to tell them, right? Has it been difficult to get your stories out over the last decades?
Well, I kind of referred to that. I find that sometimes, well, I had an experience where a producer, I was pitching stories about the Cuban experience. And whenever I tried to talk about the repression taking place on the island, my stories didn't make it. And the producer finally told me, look, I'm going to stop you. I'm not sympathetic to those stories. And that's because of what I said earlier. They're looking at it through a lens. They think that you're whatever. Some people protect the revolution to the end. And so they don't want to look at or listen to what Cubans are saying. And that's what has happened to me. I just had a pulled from a very well-regarded policy journal. The editor loved it, but it was pulled because somebody on the board decided they had heard enough of Cuban Americans from Cuban Americans. And that was that.
Which is astounding to me, because I feel like every time we connect, you tell me another story that helps me understand Cuba and Cuban American experiences more. So you and I met because I now spend most of my time in first person on stage storytelling, or storytelling in the nonprofit sector, giving speeches, meeting with donors, engaging volunteers. And I called you and I said, so I do co-produce a storytelling show called Stories from the Stage. You can watch it on World Channel or PBS. And I said, Anna, would you stand on stage and tell a 7-minute, story from your memoir? And this was your first time, right? Like, how was that transition from page to stage, as we like to say?
Well, it was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done, to tell a story without notes, and I worked so hard on writing it down the first time. And when I read it to you, you were like, oh boy,
No.
Every word that I write, I mean, when you're writing for the page, every word matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to make it beautiful like that. And you said, no, storytelling isn't going to be beautiful. It's going to be messy, a little messy. It took me a long time I don't know that I've ever really completely let go of that. It's very frightening for me as a writer to get up there and tell a story with no notes and let it be imperfect. But my connection to my children and my husband that night was something that I'll never forget. And it's because they heard it in an imperfect way. They heard the whole message of what I wanted to say, but in a very imperfect way, with real emotion coming out in a way they'd never heard it before. And they were so proud of me.
We were all so proud of you. Let's be clear.
I mean, frankly, I was kind of proud of myself too, because I survived something that was going to kill me. But
I think it's important for people who maybe don't have experience with the style of storytelling we're talking about, is that storytelling should always sound conversational. You want to sound as authentic, like you're sitting at a cafe or sitting in a bar, because that's how people lean and engage with you. And it is especially hard for writers to go, again, from page to stage, because we don't write like we talk. When we talk, we say things like, my mom called from the kitchen. In writing, you might be like, my mother declared, as the smells of the dinner wafted through the room. Like, it's finding a balance, and I couldn't do what you do, but you did it so beautifully. In a few short description, can you describe the story you told? This is the piece we were going to show, but you should definitely watch the link when we send it afterwards. But what story did you describe on stage that night?
I told the story of our last normal night in Cuba, from the point of a 5-year-old me, who had no idea what was happening, and how we got tossed out of the house. And we were standing on the street. The guard, basically what had happened is that my parents had supported the revolution. My mother had even risked her life because she had collected medicine for the rebels. But then they saw that the revolution wasn't delivering what it had promised, basically democracy, and applied to leave the country in 1964. And they didn't know if or when they'd be allowed to leave, when the permission would come through. The permission itself was something perfect, brand new since the revolution, because before the revolution, Cubans could come and go. So in 1967, we get our permission while we're all about to sit down to eat dinner, and a guard knocks at the door and pack it all up, and out you go. Pack up one suitcase. My grandmother, the one I told you about, who had been crying in New Hampshire, started crying that day and never stopped. The next day we were on a plane. We were being interrogated at the airport. We barely said goodbye to anybody. We didn't have anything of value with us. We had to leave everything behind. And then, as I said, we after a few days in a refugee processing center outside of Miami, we ended up in New Hampshire. While as a kid, I was fascinated by the snow and the magic of all of that, there was no escaping the fact that there was something massive had happened to us. And you could see it all around, even though, I knew that the adults were pretending to be happy, but they were just pretending to be happy. And a kid knows that. I would find my mother crying in a bedroom, and I'd go and I'd bring her an aspirin. I remember bringing her an aspirin, and she'd say, because she would say that her back hurt. And then I remember my grandmother crying in bed every night, and I mean, my body would shake because I could feel her sobbing every night. And I started to hear for the first and the only time in my life these voices that would come into my head, and I would hear them, and they were terrifying because they were like metal and loud, and I never told anybody about them because I was trying to be brave, just like everybody in the family was trying to be brave. And I think in the story that I told, I mentioned that the one thing I could see made everybody happy was when letters would come through from Cuba. And I have the letters now, and they're really soft like tissue because they've been held so often and open and closed. And the letters were just a way to stay connected to home, and you can read the voices of those women from the barrio. We came from a very poor barrio, and we left there were 4 generations of my family living there, and we never saw many of them again. But those neighbors and relatives in the letters were we were writing to them and they were writing to us, and we were keeping each other alive and giving each other a sense of home somehow.
Yeah. You and I have talked, you and I love the letters. I really encourage people to watch this piece. There's her message about being brave is so beautifully, it's poignant, and it also is beautifully delivered. Anna, it takes bravery to share your story, whether at a microphone or in a book. What advice do you have for other people who may have had the refugee experience about telling or writing their stories?
I think that not being afraid to tell the ugly parts, the real, ugly parts is, well, I think it's something that you can get to. You may not start there, but I think that the value is, you kind of alluded to this earlier, just of understanding yourself. And so write just to understand for yourself and to find what truth it is you think is worth sharing. That, because the refugee experience is part of being human. If you think about it, we're all, human beings have been fleeing from awful things. And it's got to be in our DNA somewhere. And I think that's what if a refugee is interested in talking about it, that we're trying to reach back for that, tell each other about that.
We talk a lot about whether it's on page or on stage, telling from the scar, not the wound. So finding space to make meaning of the events we go to, and then being able to share them with others. So Anna and I have worked with many people on stories, and in my own work, helping refugees tell theirs. One of the things I encourage you, if you're someone who's starting out and trying this for the first time, or you're someone who's an ally that wants to help people tell stories, is to really focus on start with the specific memories or the specific moments. Oftentimes when someone pitches a story to me that there's refugee experience, it's like the whole life story, right? And there is room, and we hope more people tell memoirs. But when you're telling a piece, maybe to a group of volunteers or to a local media, finding something that people can relate to, like Anna said, but also that you can relive in a singular moment. So like Anna's piece, your piece spans only your first year, it jumps in time, but mostly it's those first days and then a little bit of the time afterwards. So I worked with a young man that I know you met, BR, he's from South Sudan. We had a conversation between both because Anna had 1 day to leave and he spent 22 years in a refugee camp, and we were comparing your experiences. But when he was choosing what to tell in his story, his first draft was the whole story. And I said, the thing about telling the whole story is you kind of fall into the trap of the chronology only, or not having time to dig into the emotions. And so when he kept unpacking his story, he ended up choosing one afternoon from his time in those 22 years in the refugee camp. And it was so compelling because it was about the day that he was in school in a camp in Kenya, and his teacher's reading him a poem, and it's basically entitled The Refugee Experience. And he and the other boys, who were like 10 or 11, they raise their hand and they say, "What is a refugee?" Which you have to imagine to the teacher was like, well, you, right? But he says, when you've been born as a refugee and you've grown up in a refugee camp, you don't know anything else. So finding out that there was another world one could live that would be not a refugee experience for him was transformative. And what it led to for him was going and asking his mother and others to tell their stories to make meaning of their experience. And so he told the story like Anna did on stage, which was just as compelling. And he's gone on and told the story in schools and to companies as a way to help people understand, again, these singular moments that can be incredibly transformative. We also, Anna, you and I both agree that it's important for not only refugees to tell their stories, but also those of us with connections too, because migration impacts all of us, right? What advice would you have tell someone who perhaps hasn't lived your life, but wants to get into storytelling or perhaps share theirs?
Well, I think it's related to what you mentioned earlier, which is a specific thing. You know, what has value or meaning to you. So I want to make sure I understood the question related to refugee.
Sorry, I didn't set you up as well as I could have on that. I apologize. So one of the reasons I told my story, right, is because in Lewiston, so many people writing about the refugee experience in Lewiston were outsiders, first of all. Reporters, others, people who hadn't lived through our experience with resettlement. But also, so often I find in the Refugee Resettlement Network, we either tell the refugee story or we tell an agency story. But what I think is really amazing about storytelling is it can be a model, right? It can introduce us to the relationships that people have and what does it really look like to create belonging and inclusive communities. You and I joked earlier or chatted about my mom's story, right? So I use this often. My mother, when Somalis started moving into Lewiston, which those of you that may not know, we were a predominantly 99% white community. We did not have a mosque. We had very few people of color in the school system. When I graduated, there was 2 students of color and they were twins. So it was a large change for our community. So my mother came home one day from the grocery store the first time she saw a Somali woman in the store. And she's like, Cheryl, I saw a Somali at the grocery store. And I was like, okay, like as if this was supposed to be a big event. But she wanted to create a welcoming community. She wanted to do something, but she didn't know what to do. And I said, well, what did you do? And my mom was an introvert. She was kind of shy. She didn't know how to like bridge that relationship, even though she had well intentions. And apparently the Somali woman was holding a can of peas and some frozen peas. And she said, I could tell she couldn't decide which ones to buy. So I went up to her, I pointed to the frozen peas and I ran off. And I have to imagine that this was an awkward situation for the woman. But for me, it speaks to that we just take for granted that people want inclusive communities, right? We take for granted that becoming friends with someone from a different part of the world or a different culture is just sort of natural. It actually takes vulnerability. And so one of the things you and I have talked about is telling the stories of people's connections across cultures or across ethnicities or, foreign born and US born is also important. So I'd encourage the people watching today, think about how you can be a model for what it looks like to foster belonging. Anna, I know that you've had some meaningful experiences with people who were born in New Hampshire. What role did they play in making you feel welcome?
Yeah, kind of thinking about your mom and helping the woman with the peas. She was trying to get something done, right? She was trying to solve a problem. And I think when we work together and try to do the work of solving a problem, we forget these other things that separate us and we're focused on the problem, but in solving the problem, we come together. Yeah. So, for example, my parents, all the adults in the family ended up immediately working at a rubber boot factory. Well, most of the New Hampshire residents who worked there were uneducated, but they were really, they were sympathetic because they saw that it was a young family and we didn't know anything. We didn't know how to do anything. And one of the first things that they decided needed to be done was teach my mom how to drive. She was a young mom. She needed to learn how to drive. And so the factory ladies took turns teaching her how to drive. Well, through that, they became, everybody was thinking they were getting a problem done, but what was happening is they were building a community. And maybe that's a way in.
Right. Well, in the end, the end of my mom's story is it took her a few years. She learned and went out and started engaging. Is that Ultimately, she figured out what she could do to help was to take people to the grocery store. It became full circle for her, but she did that not only to be helpful, but because she knew if she was in a enclosed space for like an hour with somebody, she would have to be vulnerable and ask questions and start to share. And so I think it takes bravery into itself. I'd love to invite people if they have questions for Anna or myself about storytelling. We'd love to engage with you. Some of our advice, again, be really specific in your stories. Pick moments, transformative moments. Pick moments that, demonstrate what you mean by a welcoming community. Another reason to do it, as I talk about as a service provider, is that oftentimes we ask refugees to tell their stories as if that's an easy thing to do, right? And sometimes we ask them to tell the worst moment of their life, which we wouldn't ourselves necessarily volunteer up. That I've worked with a lot of people who have worked with refugees and said, you need to start telling your stories too, because you demonstrate that you are invested and you understand that this is something that does take vulnerability. And what we have found is actually that decision itself can build much more meaningful relationships between you and the people that you may be supporting in the community. My favorite thing, whenever we had a storytelling show featuring people related, like Anna did in the to shows where people were telling refugee stories, was we had 6 people from 6 nationalities backstage, including someone who was US born and white, because we wanted the audience to see themselves in all of the storytellers. Is that you have these 6 strangers backstage, and pretty much everybody was like, Anna, like, I'm super nervous. Why am I doing this? But as the night went on, you would see like bravery, like, oh, she did it, I could do it. She did it, I can do it. But ultimately, the end of the night was just themes around things we have in common, right? It's no longer about a refugee experience. It's about love, courage, bravery, hope. And that's where you want to start from when you try to choose a story. But
Yes, thank you, Cheryl. And I hesitate to say that that's something that everyone on the line has in common as well. And like Cheryl and Anna said, they are generously willing to answer you all's questions. So we'll start to answer some of the questions that have already been submitted, but you can still go ahead and submit questions through the questions pane, and that's in the attendee panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. So feel free to go ahead and send along any questions there. Let me see. Oh, someone here said they, I believe, arrived as a refugee themselves, and they said their story is very short. I was born in war, raised up in ashes of war, and escaped war. Do you think I can be a storyteller?
oh my gosh, every single person on this call can be a storyteller. We have stories every day in our lives. That's actually one of the greatest things we all have in common. So 100% yes. It is interesting to me that, and this is the case in almost all of our work at Stellar Story Company. I did a presentation for nonprofit executive directors last week, and they were like, I don't know if I have a story. We all have stories. The thing is to try to, again, narrow chapters from your life, or again, take those themes. What in that whole journey that you had as a refugee, and Anna, please jump in afterwards if you have suggestions too, like what were the most meaningful moments, or who did you meet along that journey that impacted you? We had a young man from the Congo who was carrying a journal around with him, and I said, tell me about this journal. And he said, I assumed it was just a diary where he wrote his stories. And he says, actually, if you turn to the last page, he had every single person who helped him along his refugee journey from fleeing his country to the US sign it. So there alone was like 30 stories of connection with people. So Anna, do you have suggestions, or I'm sure you think he should tell or she should tell?
No, I mean, maybe I definitely think I just love the way he or she, I don't know who it was.
I believe it's he. I believe it's he.
Great.
Described those 3 things. I mean, it's compelling, as Cheryl said, just in and of itself, but maybe start with a tangible thing, something that was left behind. I wrote a piece once about a doll, my doll that I had to leave behind. Maybe he left something behind, and maybe that could be a way into the story for him. Why did he care about the thing that he left behind? I don't know how old he was.
I like that. Yeah, no, actually, I have in my house, I have a lamp that I got kind of as part of a, like at one point in time, it had been a donation to a refugee family, and I loved this lamp. I like coveted as a donations coordinator or what have you. But anyway, but I remember, like just talking about a tangible thing that yeah. But at one point in time, I told myself, I don't know if this is a bad thing to admit, that if I purchased another lamp and brought it in, I could actually take this lamp for myself, like if I purchased some more. And yeah, and I didn't do it. And then, a group of folks came in and I thought, okay, Brianne, give this lamp away. But like years later, I was in someone's house. They were a group of folks from Burma or what have you. And like, here was this lamp again. And they actually ended up moving out. And the apartment community called me to come pick up their things or what have you. And so it's always, so now I do actually have this lamp and it's one of my favorites. But it always reminds me of this group of guys from Burma, several of which I believe were like monks, and spent some good time there in North Carolina, and now I think have all moved, on to other places in the United States. But I love telling people about that lamp. So maybe this individual could also, think about that tangible item. There's a good question in here. Some of the people online work with agencies. This person works with a national agency, and they have a lot of local offices nervous about asking clients to share their story. A lot of them feel there might be a power imbalance, and that the refugee or asylee they are serving might feel forced to share, or that it's not appropriate to ask. We don't have a lot of stories because of this reason. Is there a trauma-informed way to ask refugees and asylees to share their story?
I can go. Go ahead. You want to go first, Anna?
No, I mean, I think this might be an American. I don't know. Maybe. I think that you need to ask. Ask if they ever want to tell. I mean, I think that a lot of what I've seen is that people want to be understood. They want their story to be understood, and I know because I've heard through the grapevine that some of the most recent refugees from Cuba have wanted to tell their story anonymously because they worry about what will happen in terms of reprisals to their families back home. But that's all refugees have when they come here. That's the difference, right, between an immigrant and a refugee. Most immigrants have something usually that they've brought, they chose to bring, and were able to bring a suitcase, a chest, whatever, and they can go back. But a refugee can't go back, and a refugee usually doesn't have anything. But we have our stories. It's our one thing, and when we're ready to share, we may not even know that we're ready to share until we're asked, and because we don't necessarily even know that there's going to be an upside to that sharing.
Right, that's what I was going to echo for sure. So I want to be empathetic to the individual who asked this question, because having been a director of development and communications for over 10 years for settlement agencies, I hear you. This is not it's a really important concern to have. I think it's a really important to remember it's not an all or nothing though. There are going to be clients that will not want to, and that we have to respect that. We even can usually sense the ones we don't even reach out to, right? Because but also, what we found, so at the International Institute of New England, where I most recently worked, I launched a series called Suitcase Stories, which we planned on just having 4 fundraisers featuring diverse voices of the community and call it good. But what we ended up discovering is it became and continues to be a program that's a full-time program at the Institute, because we were even surprised how many refugees wanted to share their stories. But we didn't just have refugees in the show. So a couple of things I learned from the experience. Number one is, again, you need to be doing it yourself, or you need to have more people who are not just refugees telling their stories, so people can see that it's not just tokenism. It's not just like, put the refugee who suffered on the front page of your website. Like, it needs to be a collaborative effort showing that we're more about building community. Number two, it doesn't always have to be the tragedy story. In fact, audiences are looking for moments of humor from people's lives or moments of love. When I work with someone when I go approach someone who's a refugee and ask if they want to share their story, first of all, I spend hours just getting to know that person before I even get to the point of asking them if they want to tell a story. But in that getting to know somebody, I can point out, like, that's really interesting. I had a similar experience in my work site, or I tell me more about this friendship you made in the community, so that people have a catalog of stories to draw from rather than feeling like, oh, she wants the story of the time I fled X, Y, or Z. She wants the story about a sexual assault I endured. I want the story that you want to tell. And I know that Anna would 100% agree with that. Number two is I limit the times of asking someone who's still in services, unless that service is like level 6 English or they're in IDA programs. Like, we're not asking people in the first 9 months of their resettlement unless they come forward. So one of the people that we featured often and ended up being featured in the New York Times and CNN was a young woman named Zainab, who is a Syrian refugee. She actually approached me and said, I'm concerned about how Syrians are being portrayed. How can I lend my voice? So creating an environment at your work site, we're actually going to do this workshop in a few weeks, or this lunch and learn together, about how creating a culture of storytelling. But the greatest thing that we found is sharing existing stories with your potential spokespeople so that they can see, okay, what is it and what has it led to? One of the unexpected outcomes of the series we started was people got job offers. When people were telling on stage, suddenly people got to know them because it's building a social network. We had clients being asked to give keynotes. We had people who had friendships that they wouldn't have otherwise fostered. And so there can be a lot of wonderful outcomes, but you want them to tell other people that they should try it. And now we've had over 500 immigrants and refugees tell stories through that series, because I think of the trust and respect that we tried to create.
Yeah, no, that's great. And actually, this other one is in the same vein. Just a question of, are there things that we need to keep in mind regarding like confidentiality or sharing folks' names?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on what you're using it for and what the individual's comfort level is, right? I mean, we completely understand that. So that's a personal conversation you're going to have with the client. And also, oftentimes, even those of us that tell stories, you think that the audience needs more than they need. There are ways to share a story that isn't even, you don't have to have geography in it, right? It's a conversation you share with someone in some time along your journey. It's an experience you had. I didn't identify which camp BR was in. I didn't identify who that teacher was in the camp, because the more important message is the meaning of that moment for him.
Yeah, no. And actually, this time has actually flown by here.
Yep.
So we'll wrap it up. But I appreciated the fact that you mentioned, you know, that we do have more webinars coming up in this series. And I do think, you know, you're going to talk more about the culture of storytelling and the value of storytelling in welcoming communities. But I feel like, you know, like the things that you all have shared, yeah, and just even hearing, you know, like Anna's stories, now I want to meet her whole family in New Hampshire or what have you. But you know, like I feel like anyone could take away, you all are talking about like picking one experience, and you know, whether, I think, you know, there are some folks that have lived experience on the line, and then I think of all the volunteers and sponsors and even the staff. You know, like I was just thinking, you know, in my years, right, of you know, of speaking with people and using a PowerPoint or two, just that thought, even volunteers or sponsors, you know, think about that one moment, you know, that even easier than reaching out to maybe even the refugee, you know, that, like you said, may have come in the past 9 months. If we could all think about what those moments are that we'd share, just when one of our friends asks us, so like, how are things going with that, you know, the Afghan family that you all were welcoming or what have you. But I mean, after this webinar, we can all watch the Anna's storytelling from the stage. But yeah, I'll also think about what those moments are that we're going to share with our friends and neighbors.
Well,
let me see.
Do you mind if I just mention?
No,
so Stellar Story Company actually teaches a long 6-hour course around actually how to craft thoughtful, non-trauma, intercultural stories. So that's something we do if you're interested in going to our website. But ultimately for me, what it comes down to is when I entered the refugee resettlement field, so much attention was exclusively focused on economic indicators, which are incredibly important. But I love that the shift in the last 2 decades has been as much about social belonging, because social belonging, if we can improve social belonging in inclusive communities, it actually leads to better economic indicators as well as everything else. But the way we get there, for me, is through this storytelling. Anna, I can't tell if your hand is up like you want to make a comment or you're just
No. I'm just elevating it.
But yeah, I encourage, when we do CK stories, 30% of the people in shows were staff, because refugee resettlement work is some of the most interesting, inspiring, and challenging work out there, and people need to know, what does it look like?
Yes, no, and we will, in the follow-up email also, we'll include the link to Stellar Stories as well, so folks can find out more information there. And like I said, this is the first in a series exploring the value of storytelling in welcoming communities, so we hope you all also join us in December and January. Including coming back in December and January. We'd also like to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's Lunch and Learn and hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. We ask that you take a moment right now to complete the survey. You can follow the QR code on your screen, or you can follow a link which will be dropped into the chat. And we look forward to hearing from you all. And Anna and Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us. And we appreciate both of your stories and your contributing skill to our future storytelling. And thank you. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you to all of the attendees for joining us, and we hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.